What if everything you learned about money was wrong? What if the rich play a game the poor don't even know exists? One father told him, go to school, get a safe job. The other said, learn how money works and make it work for you. This is not just a story. This is a wake-up call. Welcome to the world of Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, where the difference between financial freedom and struggle begins in the mind. This is Thinknova, and your new journey starts right now. The morning sun rose over the town of Hilo, Hawaii, casting its golden hue over palm trees and small houses. In one such neighborhood, a young boy named Robert sat on the porch, thinking deeply about something he had heard at school. His friend Mike was with him, equally puzzled. The teacher had mentioned something about taxes, about how the government takes money from your income. But neither Robert nor Mike truly understood what that meant. They were just 9 years old, yet their minds had already begun to question the way money worked in the world around them. Their curiosity wasn't born of textbooks, but from what they saw. Robert noticed that some of his classmates wore new bicycles and flashy clothes, while others did not. His own family, while loving and supportive, always seemed to be cautious with money. His father, a well-educated man with degrees and a government job, often emphasized the importance of studying hard and getting good grades. Robert respected his father deeply. He called him his poor dad, not because his father lacked intelligence or values, but because he struggled with financial security despite his education. He had a steady job and a decent salary, but financial freedom remained elusive. Bills came in, and money always seemed to be tight. Mike's father, on the other hand, didn't finish high school, but owned multiple businesses. People in the town often spoke of him with admiration and sometimes envy. He made investments, took risks, and rarely seemed worried about money. Robert came to know him as Rich Dad. The contrast between the two men fascinated Robert. On one side, his biological father, full of wisdom, constantly taught the importance of academic achievement. On the other side, Mike's father offered a different kind of education, one rooted in real-world finance, entrepreneurship, and independence. One day, Robert and Mike approached Mike's father with a proposition. They asked him to teach them how to make money. The man looked at them with keen eyes, amused yet intrigued by their earnestness. Instead of giving them a lecture or a book, he offered them a job. He said he'd pay them 10 cents an hour to work at one of his small convenience stores. The job was simple: stocking shelves, sweeping floors, and helping out with basic tasks. At first, Robert was excited. He imagined what he could buy with his earnings. But after a few weeks, the excitement wore off. The work was repetitive and boring, and the pay seemed minuscule. Frustrated, Robert decided to quit. But before he could tell Rich Dad, he was called in for a meeting. The man listened patiently to Robert's complaints. Then he smiled and said that what Robert had experienced was exactly what most people go through in life. They work hard, get a paycheck, and never question the system. Robert was puzzled. Rich Dad continued, explaining that most people live their lives being controlled by two emotions: fear and greed. Fear keeps them in jobs they dislike, worrying about not having enough money. Greed makes them spend the money they earn on things they think will bring happiness, like new gadgets or bigger houses. This conversation marked the beginning of Robert's financial education. Rich Dad told him that school teaches people how to be employees, but not how to be employers. It trains them to work for money, but not to make money work for them. From that day forward, Robert began to see the world differently. He started to notice how adults talked about money, how they made decisions, and how they let emotions rule their finances. He also noticed how his own father, despite being a brilliant academic, struggled with money matters. Rich Dad taught Robert and Mike to think beyond the paycheck. He introduced them to concepts like assets and liabilities, even though he used simple examples. He explained that an asset is something that puts money in your pocket, while a liability is something that takes money out. It was a simple rule, yet so few people truly understood it. He encouraged them to start building assets early. He pointed out that most people think their house is an asset, But it's often a liability because it costs money to maintain, and its value doesn't always increase. He wanted the boys to invest in things that generated income, like rental properties, businesses, or stocks. Over time, Robert saw how Rich Dad handled money. He didn't spend recklessly, but he wasn't afraid to invest. He valued financial intelligence more than formal education. He believed that learning how money works was the most important skill anyone could develop. Robert started to compare the lessons from his two dads. Poor Dad would say, "I can't afford that," while Rich Dad would say, "How can I afford that?" One statement closed the door to opportunity, while the other opened it. Rich Dad emphasized the power of mindset. As Robert grew older, these early lessons stayed with him. He began reading about investing, business, and financial strategy. He started to see the patterns. The rich weren't necessarily more intelligent or harder working. They just thought differently about money. Rich Dad also taught him about taxes and corporations. He explained how the wealthy legally use corporations to reduce taxes and protect their wealth. Robert was stunned. He had always thought taxes were something everyone had to pay in the same way. But Rich Dad showed him the difference between being an employee and being a business owner. Employees earn, get taxed, and spend what's left. Business owners earn, spend on expenses, and then get taxed on what remains. That small shift in structure made a huge difference. It was not about evasion, but understanding the system and playing it wisely. Rich Dad encouraged them to become financially literate, to understand accounting, investing, and markets. He said that money without financial intelligence is money soon gone. Robert also learned the importance of learning through experience. Rich Dad didn't spoon-feed them knowledge. He made them work, think, and find answers themselves. He believed that true learning comes from doing, failing, and reflecting. As the months passed, Robert and Mike tried small ventures. They collected comic books and created a mini library, charging neighborhood kids a small fee to read. It wasn't a huge success, but it was a beginning. They started seeing opportunities where others saw problems. Robert realized that the real difference between his two dads wasn't just income, it was philosophy. Poor Dad valued security. Rich Dad valued freedom. Poor Dad believed in climbing the corporate ladder. Rich Dad believed in owning the ladder. Even when he went to college, Robert noticed how most of his peers were focused on grades, degrees, and jobs. Few talked about investments or businesses. The system, he realized, was designed to produce employees, not entrepreneurs. He continued to apply Rich Dad's lessons. He bought real estate, invested in assets, and stayed frugal. He wasn't chasing luxury for the sake of status. He wanted financial independence. The mindset Rich Dad instilled was clear. Don't work for money, make money work for you. By the time Robert entered his adult years, he saw how few people truly understood their finances. Most lived paycheck to paycheck, burdened by debt, and unsure how to break free. They bought liabilities thinking they were assets. They worked harder, but got nowhere. Rich Dad had often said, "The poor and middle class work for money. The rich have money work for them." It wasn't a slogan. It was a principle. Robert realized that financial freedom doesn't come from luck, inheritance, or winning the lottery. It comes from education, mindset, and action. His poor dad had once told him that money was the root of all evil. Rich Dad disagreed. He said that the lack of money is the root of all evil. Poverty, desperation, and ignorance caused more harm than wealth ever could. And so, Robert committed to sharing what he had learned. He wanted to help others see money differently, to give them the tools they were never taught in school. This journey was just beginning, but the foundation had been laid. It wasn't about being born rich. It was about becoming financially educated. And for Robert, that education began the day he asked a simple question: "Can you teach me how to make money?" As Robert's teenage years unfolded, the contrast between his two mentors became even more visible. Poor Dad believed in following a linear path: graduate with honors, find a secure job, and work for decades. He championed job security over financial growth, benefits over risks, and steady income over passive wealth. His intentions were noble, rooted in love, but his guidance was born from a system that didn't reward boldness. Rich Dad, however, painted a different picture. He showed Robert that success wasn't just about working harder. It was about working smarter. It wasn't about being a cog in the machine, but owning the machine. Robert started to notice the pattern. Most people got a paycheck, spent it on rent, groceries, and indulgences, and then waited for the next paycheck. Some saved a little, but most didn't know where their money actually went. They paid everyone else first, the landlord, the bank, the grocery store, and paid themselves last, if at all. Rich Dad's philosophy was the opposite. Pay yourself first, he said. Build your assets before you pay your expenses. This forced Robert to become more resourceful. If he didn't have enough to cover the bills, he had to think creatively. Could he generate more income? Could he trim unnecessary costs? Could he make his money work harder? This way of thinking stretched his financial muscles. It was uncomfortable at times, but it trained him to prioritize his future self over momentary ease. Robert remembered how Rich Dad always emphasized the importance of financial literacy. It wasn't enough to make money. You had to know how to keep it, grow it, and protect it. He urged the boys to study the basics: accounting, investing, understanding markets, and reading financial statements. Most people avoided these things because they seemed complicated. But that avoidance came at a price. Rich Dad believed that ignorance cost more than education ever could. One afternoon, while walking through a quiet street in their town, Rich Dad pointed to a beautiful house and asked Robert and Mike what they saw. They described the house's structure, color, and beauty. Rich Dad nodded and said, "Most people see what's obvious. I see opportunity. I see rental income, property taxes, maintenance costs, and leverage potential. Always look beyond the surface." That moment stayed with Robert. He began to train his eyes to see opportunity where others saw comfort or fear. He stopped seeing houses as just homes and started seeing them as vehicles of wealth. The first time Robert invested in real estate, he was young and uncertain. He found a small property listed below market value. He analyzed it, ran the numbers, and found that the rent could cover the mortgage and still leave a little surplus. It wasn't a grand profit, but it was a start. He took the plunge, borrowed prudently, and managed the property himself. Over the months, he watched as the asset not only provided monthly cash flow, but also appreciated in value. That first taste of passive income changed him. It wasn't just the money. It was the sense of control, the realization that he could build a life not dictated by a paycheck, that he didn't need to wait until retirement to enjoy freedom. He could build it now, step by step. Robert saw how his peers were entering the workforce. Many had student loans, car loans, and credit card debt. They were excited about new jobs, new apartments, and new gadgets. But behind that excitement was stress. The monthly obligations mounted, and savings were minimal. They followed the path they were told would lead to success, but it often led to financial chains. Golden cages, as Rich Dad would say. Meanwhile, Robert kept learning, investing, and expanding his understanding of money. He made mistakes, investments that didn't pan out, properties that drained more than they yielded. But Rich Dad had always taught him that failure is part of the process. The key is to fail fast, learn quickly, and never repeat the same mistake. One principle that Rich Dad hammered again and again was this: mind your own business. He didn't mean start a business necessarily, but rather focus on building assets. Whether you worked a job or ran a company, you had to build something that could function without your daily presence. For Robert, that meant real estate, investments, and writing. He wanted to create income streams that could flow even while he slept. He saw that the biggest trap was lifestyle inflation. As people earned more, they spent more. A raise led to a bigger car, a nicer apartment, or an expensive vacation. The increase in income was offset by an increase in liabilities. Rich Dad called it the rat race. Running faster, working harder, but getting nowhere financially. Robert was determined to escape it. He began studying the psychology of money, why people spend the way they do, why they fear investing, and why financial education was often ignored. He realized that money was more emotional than logical. People bought things not because they needed them, but because they wanted to feel better, to impress others, or to feel successful. One evening, he sat across the dinner table with his poor dad, who was frustrated about rising bills and shrinking savings. Robert tried to share some of what he had learned, but his poor dad dismissed it, saying he wasn't interested in risky ventures. He preferred the security of his job and pension. Robert didn't argue. He understood now that not everyone wanted to be rich. Some wanted stability more than freedom. Some wanted predictability more than growth. He respected that choice, but chose a different path for himself. As he acquired more properties and investments, Robert also began writing down the principles that guided him. Not just for himself, but to teach others who were stuck in the same cycle he once feared. He remembered one of Rich Dad's most powerful lessons, that the rich buy assets, the poor only have expenses, and the middle class buys liabilities thinking they are assets. It sounded harsh at first, but it was true. A new car that depreciates the moment it's driven off the lot is not an asset. A house that consumes more than it provides can be a burden. Real assets generate income. Robert began categorizing everything in his life into these buckets. Was it an asset? Did it put money in his pocket? Or did it drain resources? This simple filtering tool changed how he spent, invested, and planned. As years passed, Robert's confidence grew. He had financial setbacks, economic downturns, and changing markets. But his foundation remained solid because it wasn't built on trends. It was built on principles. Rich Dad had also taught him about the power of learning from mentors. Surround yourself with people smarter than you. Learn from their mistakes, model their behavior, and adapt. Robert began attending seminars, reading biographies, and engaging with entrepreneurs. Each story added a new perspective, a new layer to his understanding. He saw that most millionaires didn't win the lottery or inherit money. They built it, brick by brick. They leveraged knowledge, took calculated risks, and learned from failure. One of the most underrated tools Rich Dad gave Robert was the power of communication. He said that learning to sell, to negotiate, and to tell your story was crucial. You could have the best idea in the world, but if you couldn't communicate it, it would stay buried. So Robert practiced speaking, writing, and presenting. He developed his voice, not just for business, but to share what he had learned. The world was changing rapidly. Technology, globalization, and automation were transforming how people worked and lived. Job security was no longer guaranteed, even with advanced degrees. Robert believed that financial education was no longer optional. It was essential. He saw people in their 40s and 50s with no savings, drowning in debt, and clinging to jobs they hated. He saw young adults entering the workforce with little idea of how money worked. He felt a deep sense of urgency, not just for himself, but for society. If people didn't change the way they thought about money, they would remain trapped. That's why he began teaching, speaking, and writing, not to show off, but to serve. He wanted to share the path that had changed his life. A path that began when a 9-year-old boy asked, "Can you teach me how to make money?" Robert stood at a crossroads in his adult life, aware that the lessons from both his fathers had now taken firm root in his identity. On one side, he had the stability, discipline, and academic training of his poor dad, who had lived a life of service and security. On the other, the financial sharpness and entrepreneurial thinking of his rich dad, who had learned the mechanics of money not from books, but from doing, failing, and adapting. With every business meeting, investment decision, or personal challenge, Robert could hear the echoes of both voices in his mind. His poor dad would warn about risk, advise caution, and encourage a backup plan. His rich dad would push for bold thinking, action over fear, and making money work as a loyal servant instead of being its slave. Robert was now actively building his asset column. Real estate, small businesses, paper assets, intellectual property. He began diversifying, not in a scattered way but strategically. Rich Dad had always warned against diversifying just to minimize risk. True diversification, he explained, came after mastering a single category and then using its success to branch out. Robert took that advice seriously. He studied the patterns of successful investors, read their stories, attended lectures, and analyzed markets. He wasn't just throwing money at ideas, he was feeding his financial intelligence daily, and yet he noticed something troubling. Despite all the available knowledge, most people remained financially stuck. Not because they were lazy, but because they were afraid. Afraid of losing, of looking foolish, of stepping outside what they knew. Robert understood this fear. He had felt it too. But Rich Dad had taught him that fear isn't the enemy. It's how one responds to fear that determines success or failure. Most people let fear paralyze them. The successful use fear as a compass, guiding them toward the next challenge. He began to speak to more people, friends, co-workers, strangers at events. He saw how the conversation around money was often coded in shame, pride, or confusion. People pretended to know more than they did or avoided talking about finances entirely. This silence, Robert realized, was dangerous. One day, while visiting his old neighborhood, he saw a man in his 40s sitting on the porch of a small house, staring blankly at a pile of unpaid bills. That image triggered something. It reminded Robert of the path most people took, the path of quiet struggle. He knew he had to do more than build his own wealth. He needed to share the blueprint. He began writing, not just about money, but about the thinking behind money, about the mindset, the habits, and the emotional discipline it took to break free from financial dependence. He wrote about how schools taught algebra but not asset management, history, but not how to read a balance sheet. He emphasized how people spent years learning to earn money, but no time learning how to keep or grow it. The more he shared, the more he saw how hungry people were for this knowledge. Not just the wealthy, but middle-class families, students, retirees, and even professionals making six-figure incomes but living in fear of sudden job loss. He told them what Rich Dad had told him. It's not how much you make, but how much you keep and how well that money works for you. One of Rich Dad's key teachings had been about the cash flow pattern of the rich versus the poor. The poor earn, spend, and then try to save what's left. The rich earn, invest, and then spend from the income those investments generate. Robert created a visual of this concept, a simple cash flow diagram that showed how money moved. People were shocked by how clearly it explained their financial problems. He explained that poor and middle-class people often focus on income statements. They see how much they earn and how much they spend. But they ignore the balance sheet, the list of assets and liabilities. Rich Dad had always stressed that financial growth happens on the balance sheet, not just the income statement. Robert began creating tools to help people understand these ideas. He developed games, simulations, and workshops. He knew that teaching through experience was more powerful than lectures. That's how he had learned, from that 10 cents per hour job and those early small ventures with Mike. At one of his workshops, a woman asked him what the most important investment was. Stocks? Real estate? Businesses? Robert smiled and answered, "The most important investment is in your own mind." He meant it. Financial education wasn't about memorizing formulas. It was about training your mind to think differently, to question assumptions, and to make decisions based on long-term vision rather than short-term comfort. He had seen how people with average salaries had built wealth through discipline and knowledge, while others with high incomes lived paycheck to paycheck because they didn't manage their money well. He remembered a phrase from Rich Dad, "Your house is not an asset unless it puts money in your pocket." It was controversial, even offensive to some. Many believed owning a home was the ultimate sign of success. But Robert explained that if a house drains money monthly through mortgages, maintenance, and taxes without generating income, it is, in fact, a liability. This was a wake-up call for many. Robert continued emphasizing the importance of assets. A rental property that provides monthly income. a stock portfolio that grows over time, a book that generates royalties, a business that earns even when you sleep. He encouraged people to start small. Don't wait for the perfect investment or the perfect moment. Start with what you can, learn, and grow. He also warned against the illusion of job security. He had seen companies lay off workers overnight, pensions vanish, and industries collapse. The world was changing too fast to rely on old formulas. The new economy rewarded agility, creativity, and financial intelligence. Robert spoke of people who had lost everything and rebuilt because they understood the fundamentals of money. He saw how mindset often mattered more than money itself. He once visited a college friend who earned a good salary but was drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out, a car loan, a big mortgage, and little to no savings. His friend said he felt trapped. Robert didn't judge. He had seen this story many times. He offered to help, to share what had worked for him. But the friend wasn't ready. He believed that a raise would solve his problems, that more income was the answer. Robert knew better. Without a change in habits, more income would only lead to more expenses. It's not about what you earn. It's about what you do with what you earn. Over the next few years, Robert continued writing, teaching, and investing. He watched as his words began to reach people across the world. His books became tools for those hungry to escape financial uncertainty. He received letters from students, single parents, retirees, and even teenagers, thanking him for opening their eyes. Some had bought their first rental property. Others had started budgeting differently. Some had simply stopped using credit cards recklessly. Each story reaffirmed his mission. Rich Dad had once told him, "If you want to be rich, you need to be willing to be misunderstood. People will criticize, mock, and challenge you. But if your principles are sound, time will prove you right." Robert held on to that truth. He saw critics say his advice was too simplistic, too aggressive, too outside the norm. But he didn't mind. He wasn't trying to please everyone. He was trying to awaken those who were ready. And for those who were ready, his message was a lifeline. He emphasized that building wealth wasn't just about luxury, it was about freedom. The freedom to spend time with your family, pursue your passions, and live without constant financial stress. It was about choosing a life, not settling for one. That's why Robert kept teaching, writing, and investing. Because he knew that financial freedom wasn't just a dream, it was a skill. And like all skills, it could be learned. The years passed, and Robert saw how financial education was slowly becoming part of the conversation in homes, schools, and media. What was once dismissed as unconventional now found a place at kitchen tables and corporate seminars. But Robert knew that the core struggle remained unchanged. People were still working jobs they disliked, living paycheck to paycheck, afraid of losing what little they had, while dreaming of one day becoming rich. He returned to the fundamentals. He reminded his readers and audiences that wealth begins in the mind. It starts not with a paycheck or an inheritance, but with a decision to learn, to think differently, and to act consistently. Robert remembered how years earlier, he had been afraid to invest in his first property. The numbers were uncertain. The risk felt real. But Rich Dad had told him that analysis doesn't eliminate fear. Only action does. And it was true. Every time he stepped outside his comfort zone, whether it was speaking to a room full of strangers or signing a deal that stretched his finances, he grew. Not just financially, but mentally. He spoke often now about the power of habits. That financial success wasn't about a single decision, but about daily disciplines, tracking expenses, reviewing investments, reading market trends, saying no to unnecessary purchases, and learning constantly. He had built what Rich Dad called financial muscle, a strong foundation that could withstand economic storms. When the markets crashed, Robert didn't panic. He saw opportunities. While others were selling in fear, he was buying with caution and clarity. He knew that the market would recover. It always did. But those who prepared would benefit most. He often shared stories of people who had no financial background, but had transformed their lives. A single mother who began investing small amounts and now owned several properties. A college dropout who built a business around a passion project. A retiree who turned her life savings into income-producing investments by learning late in life. These stories were proof that it was never too early or too late to begin. Robert kept emphasizing the value of starting. Even if you only had $100, you could invest in knowledge. Even if you had only an hour a week, you could begin tracking your finances. Every step counted. One of his favorite lessons remained the importance of knowing the difference between assets and liabilities. It was a line he repeated again and again because it changed lives. Most people got trapped because they bought liabilities thinking they were assets. A fancy car, a big house, expensive vacations, all felt like signs of success, but often they drained money instead of creating it. Robert urged people to redefine wealth, not in terms of material things, but in terms of time. How many months could you live without working based on your passive income? That, he said, was real wealth. He remembered a moment when he stood in front of a crowd of young entrepreneurs. He asked how many of them had been taught about money in school. Only a few hands went up. Then he asked how many had learned about the Pythagorean theorem. Almost every hand rose. He smiled and said, "That's the problem." He wasn't mocking education. He believed in learning, but he believed education had to evolve. Children should learn about credit scores, interest rates, taxation, entrepreneurship, and real-world finance alongside math and science. He continued to advocate for educational reform. He spoke to institutions, governments, and nonprofits, urging them to include financial literacy as a core subject. The resistance was strong, but he knew that change would come slowly, through people, not policies. And so he focused on people. He traveled the world, teaching, listening, and sharing. In India, he met a group of young students running a school-based investment club. In Africa, he met women who had pooled savings to start a micro-business. In Europe, he met a man who had escaped poverty through careful investing and now taught others. Each encounter filled him with gratitude, not because of their success, but because of their willingness to change, to challenge old beliefs. Back home, Robert reflected on his journey. From that curious boy asking questions about money to the man now guiding others. It hadn't been smooth. There were failures, betrayals, market crashes, and personal challenges. But the principles held strong. Spend less than you earn. Invest in assets. Learn daily. Take action. Stay out of bad debt. Build income that doesn't rely on your time. He knew he still had more to learn. Financial education was not a destination, but a journey. Markets evolved. Laws changed. Technology disrupted. But the fundamentals remained timeless. He encouraged people to read, not just books, but markets, behavior, and trends. He warned against emotional decisions, buying in fear or selling in panic. He taught the value of delayed gratification, of reinvesting profits instead of indulging too early. One lesson he often repeated was the importance of financial independence over wealth. You didn't need millions to be free. You just needed control. Control over your time, your income, and your decisions. Robert saw that people who chased status often lost peace, but those who chased purpose built lasting fulfillment. He also began to talk more about giving back. Rich Dad had once told him, "Money is a tool. Once you have enough, use it to lift others." Robert started foundations, funded education programs, and supported entrepreneurship in underserved communities. He believed that true wealth came from sharing, from impact. He also revisited the emotions tied to money. Fear, shame, greed, guilt. All of them influenced financial behavior. People weren't just logical beings, they were emotional, and their money patterns reflected their inner world. That's why he encouraged self-reflection. Understand your money story. Were you raised to fear it? Worship it? Ignore it? Heal your relationship with money and your actions will follow. He taught couples to talk openly about finances, families to teach children early, and communities to break the silence around money. As his message reached millions, he never forgot the moment it all began. Sitting with Mike on a warm Hawaiian morning, confused about taxes, hungry for answers. It was a small question that sparked a lifetime of impact. Can you teach me how to make money? That question led to a new way of thinking. It led to a realization that schools don't prepare people for financial life, that working harder doesn't always mean getting ahead, that true wealth is built, not given. Robert closed his journals, looked out his window, and smiled. He knew that somewhere, another young boy or girl was asking the same question, and that meant the mission continued. Because in the end, Rich Dad's greatest gift wasn't money, it was mindset. And once your mind is rich, your reality will follow. The rich don't work for money. They make money work for them. Today, you've taken one step closer to breaking free from the paycheck to paycheck cycle. But remember, knowing isn't enough. It's time to act, to invest in yourself, and to think like the rich. If this story sparked something inside you, don't let it fade. Subscribe to Thinknova, where powerful ideas fuel your future. Because your journey to financial freedom has just begun.